Welcome to the first module of the course More Inclusive Education from Thinking to Action. This first module is the one where we start by talking about inclusive education, and here we will cover topics such as the evolution from special education to inclusive education, a new educational paradigm and the barriers and facilitating factors to inclusion. In this module, we aim to identify diversity and difference as essential factors for changing the educational paradigm, develop a critical understanding of concepts and assumptions about diversity and difference, identify barriers and factors, power, pains of an inclusive education, and finally, identify dimensions for an inclusive education. Historically, we know that we have evolved from the concept of special education to inclusive education. The goal of ensuring quality education for all and the importance of providing the holistic support needed to develop each child's potential are clear in both the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And for decades, pupils with special educational needs have used resource centers to provide the school with additional skills to accommodate pupils with difficulties. Special schools allow students with even more severe conditions of disability to attend and share their education with other students in the same condition. However, the challenges were cross-cutting. Insufficient, sometimes inadequate resources, lack of organization with the school, and the whole set of circumstances that led to these responses becoming more and more separate structures. In some countries, such as Portugal, the special education teacher was seen as the only responsible and knowledgeable person for the teaching-learning processes of disabled students. So, for decades, it was felt necessary to evolve from the concept of special education to the concept of education. In practically all European countries, the area of special and inclusive education has undergone rapid and profound changes that have altered the nature of an area that for many years was associated with a welfare perspective. As we have seen, the international classification of functioning used for the assessment and planning of intervention with students is still used to label students and assess their educational potential, which invites us to reflect. Thinking about the education of students with disabilities within the framework of strictly educational parameters is a recent fact, which still in many aspects constitutes an innovation. There is a pressing need to diagnose and to find meaning and guidance in this diagnosis. We will talk about this further in Module 2 of this course. So, when we talk about diversity in education, we are already talking about the school of the 21st century. The creation of the school as we know it today sought an ethic of equality, sought to welcome different people and give them all the same to achieve a fair social regime. Disability is a part of human diversity, and people with disabilities are also a heterogeneous group. Therefore, the awareness of the need to make the school a structure that serves all students on an equal footing has first of all encountered the dimension of diversity. So, in this historical perspective, many questions have arisen. If the school had been created to give everyone the same, how could it start to differentiate what it gave? If we conclude that students are diverse, can they all be taught as if they were one? And yet, if the students are diverse, is it possible to assess their progress in the same way? The school itself can be a producer of homogeneity and indifferentiation. Because the school in itself, in wanting to work in the same way, to treat everyone in the same way, is promoting homogeneity. It is not promoting singularity and working towards the uniqueness of each human being. So we are facing a necessary change of paradigm in which many questions call our attention. To see the necessary evolution, it is important to make education more and more inclusive. It is this paradigm that we want to bring as a flag, not only as an intention, but also as a practice of not leaving any student behind. When we talk about diversity, we often find ourselves talking about difference. And before we talk about diversity itself, I would like to invite you to think about how we look at difference. Martha Minow, in her Just Schools book, says that we should question the way things are, and look at difference as being a relationship with someone, and that we need to be very critical when we think about who we are judging to be different. I'd like you to reflect on that too. How do you view difference? Difference in itself is not something negative or causes inequality. Differences between people make societies more interesting. However, it is the meanings and values applied to these differences that make them harmful. The problem lies in the intention and importance attached to some of these differences. I can have 20 students, all of them different, and not classify any of them as better or worse. They are simply different, with specific characteristics and distinctive positive features. One does not have to look at this difference in a negative way. Educational policies mediate the processes of construction of these notions of diversity and difference. Difference tends to be used in a more negative way when the student's characteristics are problematic, so that the students are considered different from the others. Diversity, on the other hand, is a multifaceted concept that lends itself to multiple interpretations. Usually, diversity is presented in a more positive way where we want to value it. So, reflect on the way you talk about your students. Do you say you have a student who is different, or do you say you have a diverse class? Thinking about the importance of this theme and about talking to your students about what diversity is and what difference is, we developed this video that we are going to watch next.
Have you ever heard of diversity? What does it mean to be different? Have you ever wondered what the world would be like if we were all the same? The truth is that we are all different from one another. There are taller people and shorter people. People who like noise and people who prefer silence. People who like heat and others who prefer the cold. People who are happy and people who are often sad. People who communicate with words and others who do not. We're all different. Isn't it the difference that makes us special? Understanding, accepting, and valuing differences is being inclusive. It is the first step towards making everyone feel accepted and reducing prejudice. By living with different people, we get to know new ideas and ways of being. It helps us to be more creative, to solve problems. It teaches us to be more empathetic, understanding, and to be less selfish. If diversity is not valued, there can be no equal opportunities. Only then is it possible to create a fair society where everyone has a chance to participate and succeed. Diversity is in our everyday life, and it is everywhere, which means that it is also in schools. And we all have the right to be at school, to feel comfortable in school, to experience school. Yes, we are all different, but we have more in common than we think. And yes, it's by living our differences that we can all build a better school.
A better world!
find this and other videos on the IncEdu YouTube channel. More than developing policies, it is important that they translate into concrete practical changes. To this end, it is crucial to see individual differences not as problems, but as opportunities for diverse and enriching learning. Difference should be perceived, but as a means for innovation and enrichment, benefiting all students regardless of their specificities, and this is how inclusion emerges in education. It is necessary to look at the education system and change it to respond to the diverse characteristics of students. It is not the students who should be asked to change and adapt to the system. Alan Dyson is one of the authors who argues that when we realize that the student is different, that this creates dilemmas for us as teachers or educators. The intention as educators that we treat all students equally and with all equal intention is opposed to treating them differently and uniquely. These internal dilemmas between intentions to treat students equally but simultaneously treat them as the unique beings they are set up in pedagogical practice in 3 phases. In the phase in which we identify the students and whether or not we realize they are different and tend to label them. In the placement phase, namely the phase in which we define classes and in which we designate these classes as regular classes or special classes. And in the curriculum phase, the definition of what is going to be implemented. Do we teach everyone the same? Do we allow different students to follow their own interests? Do we have the curriculum in the most functional way? So, faced with these dilemmas, there is no perfect solution. It is very important that, as educators, we can understand that inclusion is a never-ending process. It is an attitude about how we deal with diversity and difference, as well as social justice and equity for vulnerable groups within the education system. In inclusive education, it is essential that teachers face the diversity present in a classroom in a positive way, that they're able to bring out the best in everyone and that these differences are seen as advantages rather than disadvantages to their peers. The attitude towards difference is based on intolerance and abuse of power to create and perpetuate inequalities. So making schools inclusive, according to these authors, can contribute to making people aware of their discriminatory attitudes and practices when we talk about inclusion. It is also necessary to talk about equality and equity. These terms are not always clear to us educators ourselves. According to the European Agency, equity can cover equity in access to school, equity in the distribution of learning opportunities, equity in obtaining opportunities and chances to succeed. So equity is very much related to access to any form of education, and it focuses on ensuring that all learners have high quality and educational opportunities within their community and alongside their peers. The concept of equality brings us back to the responsibility of ensuring equal opportunities for those who are excluded. This is not only the responsibility of governments who think and make educational policies, but of all actors who work together to support the lives of vulnerable people. Inclusion cannot be about doing away with differences, but about ensuring that those individual, behavioral, and cultural differences find ways to unite in what they have in common and to learn and respect each other in what they are different. Inclusion is therefore not based on need, but on the rights of the subject. Some even say that inclusion is a right. But according to some authors, namely Professor David Rodrigues in Portugal, inclusion is a right across all rights. For the principles of equality and equity to be integrated in educational policies, it is necessary to take some attitudes. First of all, to value the presence, participation, and achievement of all students, regardless of their difficulties or personal characteristics. Then it is necessary to survey and assess the barriers to education, participation, and achievement of all these learners, with particular attention to those who may be at greater risk of underachievement, marginalization, or exclusion. After doing this needs assessment, it is crucial to develop the capacities of educators, as well as the system, creating learning and support environments that are important for improving the quality of education. Creating synergies between school and community is key to promoting conditions for inclusive learning, as well as fostering a broader understanding of the principles of inclusion and equity. And finally, implementing change, recognizing that inclusion and equity in education is a continuous process. There are several ways and several perspectives of looking at the concept of inclusion. As I have already mentioned from a rights perspective, it reinforces respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, promotes mutual understanding and tolerance, and focuses on the full development of the subject's personality, reinforcing again, it is not a right and it is not a value either. It is a set of values, beliefs, attitudes related to equality and social justice, so that all children can participate in teaching and learning. It is, therefore, a choice, an attitude of each individual to be inclusive. It means, then, that everyone can have access to something, and it involves promoting a sense of belonging in the subjects. We thus conclude that inclusive education is a process consisting of several stages that we will develop throughout this course. It is essential that all schools and all educators see themselves in this intention to educate all with all. How do we start this new paradigm? First of all, it is necessary to change mentalities at a social level, to stop seeing certain children as a problem and start identifying their needs, improving the education systems themselves. This process begins, without a doubt, in the conditions of access to school. In Europe, we tend to move towards no longer having special schools and everyone being educated together. But it is fundamental that in a second phase, the participation phase, everyone feels able to participate, and for that, it is necessary to adapt the curriculum and the way of selection. It is necessary to foster a spirit of belonging. Everyone needs to feel that they belong at school. And finally, it is essential that this process is a systemic one. It is not about one class, one school, or one community. Everyone is involved. Everyone involved in the educational process is part of the inclusion process. It is therefore crucial that society in general, decisions, and all those involved in education fully understand the need for this paradigm shift. This change, besides being essentially a change of mentality, is also important in terms of language, especially regarding students with disabilities. We should abandon overly specific medical and technical terms which may contribute to the exclusion of these students. So, this new paradigm goes through various systems, and it is fundamental that there is government guidance and policy definition at the level of teacher training, organizational and curricular resources with regard to the school, that the school organizes itself and makes an effort to combat difference and implements more inclusive assessment, pedagogy, and support processes which respect the rights and meet the needs of students with specific needs, that there is a focus on school structures and processes rather than on the difficulties of learners, and to have cooperative structures and processes in place between school, family, and community. When we talk about families, there are also many adjustments that need to be made. It is necessary to develop trust by building family support networks. It is necessary to involve the family and allow them to contribute more to the school. It is often necessary for families to unite in leading the inclusive education they want to see practiced in schools. And it is important to note that inclusion needs the efforts and participation of other agencies, such as health, welfare, and child protection services. By this, we mean that inclusive education is not a school concern, it is not a family concern, it is not a government concern. Inclusive education should be a concern, an intention, and a priority of a country. In this slide, we have tried to systematize how the uniqueness and best interests of children have long been safeguarded in European guidelines and major documents on education and children's rights. An example of this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which dates back to 1948 and already stated that education should aim at the full expansion of the human personality and the strengthening of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The 1989 Declaration on the Rights of the Child introduced the concept of the best interest of the child in the development of inclusive education. In 1994, as a result of a meeting in Salamanca, the declaration resulted in an initiative on education for all. It showed that each child has his or her own characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. Educational systems should, therefore, be planned and educational programs implemented, taking into account the wide diversity of these characteristics and needs. The last document we present here dates from 2006. It is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which states that an attitude of respect for the rights of disabled people should be promoted at all levels of education and for all children. It is further reiterated that persons with disabilities are not excluded from the general education system on the basis of disability. So, why do we talk about inclusive education when this right to education has been enshrined in documents for so long? Because there are still children in the world who do not enjoy the right to be in school. All children matter, and they really matter. These are the words of UNESCO. In the document it issued in 2017, inclusive education therefore aims to ensure that each and everyone has access to an education that is not only of quality, but also equal. This is how we illustrate the path of inclusion, a long path, a never-ending path, as we have already mentioned, whose ultimate goal is to find the best responses to the diversity present in schools. A path full of obstacles, among others, the instability that students with difficulties cause in a classroom, and the fact that there are spaces of greater inclusion coexisting with segregation spaces, and that have hindered educational reform until today. This is a path that is not linear. It is a path made of choices, and with each choice, we advance to a new stage. The first stage will be to foster a sense of belonging in each and every student. How can we do this? By allowing them conditions of access and participation at school. A second fundamental step, which we will address next, is the identification and removal of barriers, which are a major concern for inclusion. A third step is to create the necessary conditions for all students to participate. And only then we will have the educational success of all students with learning outcomes, also resulting from adaptations to the curriculum. There are several barriers to inclusion. First of all, there are attitudinal barriers, such as peer pressure, the attitude of some parents and the set of behaviors, each on the part of teachers or peers, which hinder the inclusion process. The barriers in the school context are, among others, the distance of the school from the student's place of residence, the inadequacy of the school structure or architecture, the absence of technologies and of support material and resources, and the size of the classes themselves, which often hinders the dynamics and effective teaching-learning processes. The curriculum is also a barrier to inclusion. The reality is that, in Central and Eastern Europe, we face situations where children with disabilities have access to limited curricula. This is based on a false idea of what a disabled child is and is not capable of learning. And finally, teachers can be both enhancing factors for inclusion as well as barriers to inclusion itself. And here there are strong barriers such as the initial training of teachers with insufficient knowledge about inclusive education and the inadequate response to diversity present in a classroom, and teachers who deny themselves to this new way of teaching and this new way of being in the classroom, not segregating and including the students themselves in the educational process in an intervening way. And finally, the family as well as the teachers can be enablers or limiters of an effective process of inclusion. The lack of knowledge and information on the part of the family can be a barrier, as well as the lack of acceptance by the family of the student's difficulty. It is also important to remember that the use of the term special educational needs constitutes a barrier to the learning and participation process, hindering the development of inclusive practices. This is a term that has fallen into disuse and is now replaced by specific educational needs. When we talk about facilitating factors for inclusion, we talk without any doubt about pretending and participation. And here we talk about a change of school culture. This requires a reform of the whole educational environment. It implies that the leaders of all educational entities get involved, and that we don't just define policies, but that we go into practice through a change in school culture. Other facilitating factor is diversity itself. Recognizing diversity as a benefit is learning to live and learn with and from differences. Assessing barriers can be an enabling and facilitating factor for inclusion. Identifying and assessing them is key to improving the school environment. Reducing inequalities is a facilitating factor for inclusion. by empowering teachers and the education system. Encouraging the development of learning support environments that contribute to improving the quality of education. Encouraging the development of learning support environments that contribute to improving the quality of education. And finally, community school-family partnerships, this fundamental triad for inclusion to happen inside and outside school. This brings us to the end of the first module. So that we can check your knowledge, we suggest you answer the quiz indicated in the description of this video. What does your school need to become an inclusive school? Do you feel that you are an inclusive person or professional in practice? Why do you feel this? We hope that the experience of the first module has been positive. We suggest that you consult the handbook for further study. We propose some resources and further reading to complement what we have mentioned here. Besides taking note of your main learning experiences, we would appreciate your evaluation in the link indicated in the description of this video. Until the next module,